A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to the first talk of this NEP Orientation and Sensitization Program, which is being organized by the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. The Astronomy Center of Educators is the unit which is doing it. And before Professor Malhar Kulkarni starts off, let me just briefly introduce him. Professor Malhar Kulkarni is a student of Paninian grammar and teaches it at IIT Bombay as a professor. He has studied Paninian grammar in both traditional as well as modern university methods of education and continues to study it in both methods to this day. He has been taught by stalwarts like Pandit Vamana Shastri Bhagavad Guruji and Professor S.T. Joshi, and he has been imparting training in Paninian grammar to students in both ways in Nishkaran manner for more than 20 years, now in online as well as offline modes. Along with Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya, he is credited for making the Sanskrit WordNet an online multipurpose thesaurus, linked to such thesauruses of more than 10 modern Indian languages. He is also credited for the creation of Shabdamitra, a brand of digital tools aimed at teaching and learning of languages in school environment as well as other environments, with Sanskrit Shabdamitra as an integral part of it. Recently, he shouldered the responsibility as the first convener of the Vyakaran section of the 18th World Sanskrit Conference, held at the Australian National University in Canberra in 2023. He composes Sanskrit texts. Notable amongst them is Shabda Sutra, a text written in sutra style on language. In recognition of his contributions, he has been honored by IIT Bombay by offering him the first chair professorship for Sanskrit at IIT Bombay, called Sumati and Atmaram Kotwal Sanskrit Acharya Chair Professorship, which he continues to serve till this day since February 2022. So it's been a real pleasure and privilege to have you with us today, Professor Kulkarni, and we really look forward to your talk on Indian knowledge systems. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You can start off.
A very good evening to you all. I thank Professor Saikia for inviting me to deliver these lectures in this particular program. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to revisit my association with Ayuka when Professor Naralikar was helming this institute, and I was a student in the Department of Sanskrit in the then Pune University, and together with my supervisor, Professor Saroja Bhate, I worked with Professor Naralikar on the project of finding out the citations in Sanskrit and Prakrit literature of Crab supernova, which happened in 1054 AD. And I vividly remember our discussions with Professor Naralikar in the campus of Ayuka inside his office very vividly. And to be able to deliver these lectures in Ayuka really makes me very happy and relive those moments and brings back some kind of cheerfulness back to me when I had to speak in front of such a learned assembly in such a great institution called Ayuka. Topic that I will be talking about is Indian knowledge systems, which is introduced in the curriculum in accordance with the national education policy. So the first and foremost question is, what does IKS mean? Indian knowledge systems, what does it mean? And I have put these three words into brackets and would like to also talk about them from the point of view of the linguistic analysis. So as in linguistics, we do the bracketing of the elements which function together and convey meaning unit, we have bracketed knowledge systems together, and then Indian is also bracketed together with the knowledge systems. So this we call the structure of the word. This we call in Sanskrit terms the anvaya of the padarthas. Now, the word Indian knowledge systems is currently referred to as a multi-word expression or also a compound word. And there are lots of applications which deal with such words, such elements. And rightfully, then the first thing they do is identify the constituents and bracket them. So the constituents are knowledge systems, and then Indian is the qualification of the knowledge systems. Knowledge systems is, if we uh, look at it, we can say that it is a Tatpurusha compound, where the second member of the compound assumes the headship as far as the meaning relation is concerned. So then the adjective is about this head, and therefore Indian is an adjective of the systems, knowledge systems. The knowledge systems which are Indian. To explain it in this format once again, knowledge systems is the primary constituent, and it means the systems of knowledge. And then Indian knowledge systems refer to the systems of knowledge that are Indian. When we translate this into Sanskrit, the words that we have are Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, and I have written Bharatiya Jnana Parampara without giving any space in between on the third bullet. And we will write this in Hindi as separate words, Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, assuming, however, the same semantic base, and can be called as the multi-word expressions once again. But we will apply the rules of compounding to such words. So there is quite a lot that the system of analysis of language that has to offer in the modern world as far as the processing of the language is concerned, natural language is concerned. And Bharatiya Jnana Parampara seems to be a very remarkable example in this regard. So Bharatiya and Jnana Parampara. Jnana Parampara is the first constituent, which means Jnanasya Parampara in Sanskrit. And Jnanasya Parampara, Jnana Parampara, this is the Tatpurusha Samasa, in which the second member acts as the head of the compound. And then the other element out of the compound is related with this compound primarily through this head. And so Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, as is stated on the third bullet, and then the word generated is Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. Why is this kind of analysis significant? Will be clear as we progress, because primarily what we are dealing with is the Jnana Parampara, which is Bharatiya, which is primarily Indian. And in order to stress that, we need to also take the same explanation through the required format. And that is the reason why we have gone a little deeper into the meaning of the word Indian knowledge systems, literally, and also in Hindi or in Indian languages, namely Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. So what is assumed in this? When we talk about the Indian knowledge systems, what is assumed? that there existed a continuous process in our country, India, as it is known today, a continuous process to know more about the world outside as well as inside, and also to know the knower, one who knows, as well as to know the knowledge. So the process continued to know how we know. And so if we have a cognition at one moment, the second moment cognition can also cognize the first moment cognition. This particular process continued in our country for some amount of time is what is primarily assumed when we utter the words Indian knowledge systems. What it also assumes is that there existed a certain methodology that the knowledge seekers followed that kept them on the path of knowledge seeking in the first place, and that gave them accurate knowledge about the world around them, as well as themselves. All this resulted in the planning that they did, and also the strength to execute those plans. What it amounts to is to apply the knowledge to real life scenarios to solve real life problems. This is what is assumed when the word Indian knowledge systems is uttered, is spoken about. And all these assumptions, they need to be carefully analyzed. They can need to be carefully studied. But these are certain assumptions on which we shall progress and try to see what kind of systems existed, what kind of methodology these systems followed, and of course, what kind of set of knowledge bodies that got formed in the course of time. In this process, the thinkers who are Indian, they seem to have asked the following questions. Namely, what is to know? That means, to use the philosophical term, what is the Jnaya? This is the term that is used. Jnaya. Jnaya means something that is to be known. What is to know? At the same time, what is not necessary to know? Is there something which is not necessary to know? The most important question that they ask is, are the knower and knowledge separate? There are systems of thought which spend considerable amount of time in explicating this separateness. On the other hand, there are some other schools of thought which talk about the unity between the knower and the knowledge. There are some schools which consider that only knowledge exists without what is known. Only jnana exists and there is no jnaya. So the question is, does the knowledge exist without what is known? These are some important questions that underlie the assumptions that are made or that are available to us in the words Indian knowledge systems. Now, the next important question is, what is the correlation of the word Bharatiya with these other words, namely the knowledge systems? So the association of Bharatiya or Indian with these other words is that there is something that belongs to India, there is something that belongs to Bharata, which is what is referred to here. Something that originated in India, something that was discovered by Indians, something that was primarily focused and thought about and developed and taken to its height, taken to its conclusion in India, and perhaps also which came into contact with the scholars of other part of the world, and probably the ideas that the Indians thought about, they got spread in the course of time due to this particular contact. In this contact, the Indians also learned quite a lot, and they inculcated what they learned from those who were non-Indians. So some ideas that they learned from without were absorbed in the existing systems, and those thoughts were nourished further and developed further in India. And so something that can be said in this manner to be the unique feature of India or Bharata is what is Bharatiya. So the knowledge systems that belong to India, the knowledge systems that originated in India, the knowledge systems that the Indians developed at a point in time, and which can be said to be the unique features of India, where the external world coming into the contact of the Indian thinkers and knowledge seekers also take those thoughts forward. They also develop those thoughts and acknowledge the source and also the methodology that the Indians followed and forwarded. So that is what is the correlation of the word Bharatiya and Indian in this particular multi-word expression, Indian knowledge systems, Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. It is extremely important here to remember certain questions and their answers. So many times these questions do come up. Some people, some scholars constantly rant about some of these questions. What is important to remember here is that did everything that we have and what that we know today already exist in India? And the simple answer to this question is no. Not everything existed in India, and there is no other feeling than to accept this fact. On the other hand, the next question that can come is, did nothing that we have or know today exist in India? And the answer to this question is also no. So the other question would be, did something exist in India? And the answer to this question is yes, something did exist in India, something did develop in India, something that was spread out of India. Probably we are not paying that much attention to what this something is, and it is important for us to throw some glance at these points where we take cognizance of what already Indians knew, what was the way of thinking that the Indians developed to know certain things that make them different from other people, other groups of people. And that is what is aimed at studying under this particular stream called Indian knowledge systems. What existed in India that in some fields may not be very advanced as far as the details are concerned, as far as the methodologies are concerned. In some cases, it may be advanced, yet we are not aware of those advancements. In some cases, it may exist at zero level. That is also true. But we need to at least know something about what existed in India in different spheres of knowledge, different spheres of different domains of learning, and so on. These are the plain truths, plain facts about the Indian knowledge systems that I think are extremely important, extremely crucial. So we are not aiming at overdoing something or over-claiming something. That is not the job, that is not the goal. At the same time, we are not under doing something. We are doing exactly what existed and in what format existed in India. And probably that was not brought forward in the manner it should have been so far. And probably that is the reason why this effort needs to be done and needs to be taken seriously and academically by all concerned. So, as we understand, a system is a set of knowledge or knowledges created around a particular subject with the focus of that particular set of knowledge, including the act of knowing. And this set of knowledge is tested in accordance with the temporal as well as the spatial dimensions, often modified and validated in accordance with the new form of dimension figured out in the course of time. And then this set of knowledge is kept open for future examinations and also passed on to future generations for their valuation and, of course, the modifications and changes that they want to do, they want to bring in into these sets. And then this is done in a codified form with certain rules taking care of the whole set of knowledge. I'm sorry for this typo, a whole set of knowledge. Holding this set together, this codified form holds the set together in such a manner that it also passes some test of time. And here we can consider some amount of time roughly to be the benchmark, some 1,000 years or few thousand years and so on and so forth. So some codified set of rules that is possible to be transmitted through generations over a period of a few thousand years. That is what has happened in some cases in India, making it possible for others to decode this set of knowledge. That is what is a rough idea, a very broad outlook, a broad idea about a system. So when we are talking about the knowledge system, an Indian knowledge system, this is probably what we are looking at. This is probably what we are talking about. So the question is, did such systems at some point in time exist in India, which followed these sets of principles and rules and so on and so forth? Did they focus on a particular subject? Did they went deeper into analyzing and discovering truths about a particular subject? Did they keep the set of knowledge, a subject, open for modifications? Did they transmit it to future generations to be modified in accordance with the temporal and spatial dimensions that come into being in the course of time and space and so on? Yes. In simple terms, the answer to this question is yes. Such systems did exist in India. And therefore, we may need to take a look at those systems. We may need to look at where such systems excelled, where they excelled to a point where they influenced some other systems, and where they lacked, where they needed more innovation, where they needed more power, and so on and so forth. But the point is that such systems did exist in India in different domains and in different spheres. So the question about them is, which are these systems, and these systems existed in which domains? So what kind of subjects are handled by these systems? And the next important question is, are they available to us? The other important question is, are they available without there being any effect of the phenomena around us, namely globalization or modernization and so on and so forth? That makes this problem tricky. That makes this entire endeavor also a little bit difficult. But nonetheless, we can clearly find out what kind of domains in which these systems function. And we can also state which systems are available. These are the few domains that we can enlist immediately. The subject in the form of language, astronomy, mathematics, etc. And there are very many subjects, very many domains enlisted in many documents related to the Indian knowledge systems that are available online, as well as in other modes which list down all these different domains. What it amounts to say is that there are these different domains in which independent knowledge systems, the set of knowledge, existed in India with their own methodologies and with their own sets of foundational principles, which stood the test of time, and the Indian knowledge seekers discovered these methods to codify the knowledge that allowed them or helped them to transmit such a knowledge from generation to generation. Now, since my specialization falls in the field of language, I will focus hereafter on the same field, namely language. And there are several other scholars in our country dealing with several other fields, some of which are mentioned on this slide, namely astronomy and mathematics. And there are many other fields as well. And there are great proponents, great experts who also try to explain these very domains and the contributions, which can be called the Indian contribution. So when we talk about the language, we are dealing with the natural language and the understanding of the natural language, the knowledge of the natural language, and also the set of rules that were created in which this knowledge was codified and also transmitted in the course of time. The methodologies used by the knowledge seekers in these fields can be generally noted down to be the following. The first and the foremost is Anvaya and Vyatireka. And the second one is Avapa and Udvapa. And we shall be talking about these two primarily in the lecture that will be delivered tomorrow, primarily in the domain of language. Then there is another important methodology called Tantra Yukti, where Tantra stands for any system of knowledge and Yukti stands for such logical thinking, the methodologies. And you will find that several scholars have written quite a lot about the collections of these Tantra Yuktis in various treatises like Arthashastra and Charaka Samhita and so on and so forth. And Tantra Yuktis are primarily helpful in order to organize the knowledge in a particular consistent flow in which the reader finds it extremely enlightening and also very much useful. And that also tells us about the overall view as to how an individual can look at, a knowledge seeker can look at a particular subject. Sutra style and Bhashya style is another extremely important methodology in order to encode the knowledge that is available. Adhikarana style is also an important method in order to codify the knowledge that is gained. So Anvaya, Vyatireka and Avapa, Udvapa, these are the two methodologies that are used to gain knowledge. These are the methodologies used in order to figure out constituents of the facts, and these are the methodologies used for the purpose of analysis and gain more knowledge. Whereas Tantra Yukti, Sutra Bhashya style and Adhikarana style, these are the methodologies used to organize the already collected knowledge in the form of the methodologies of Anvaya, Vyatireka and Avapa, Udvapa. So Anvaya, Vyatireka, Avapa, Udvapa, etc. and other Tantra Yukti, etc. These are the typical Indian styles. These are the typical Indian methodologies that were evolved at an early date in India, and probably we also have them available and also probably have them in an advanced state available to us now. But it is important to remember that these states were also available to us, and rather they are the very basic methodologies in order to know something about a particular object like language, particular object of cognition like language. And also Sutra Bhashya style is very unique. Adhikarana style is very unique as far as the adjective Indian to the knowledge systems are concerned. It is primarily the sutra style of writing that also ensured the transmission of a particular set of knowledge. So in the Indian tradition, most of the primary sources are in various domains, in various fields. They have been composed in the format of the sutra, which is a very terse sentence, very small sentence, but having a very general kind of application. And obviously, there is a need to explain this sutra, which is then explained by elaborate commentaries, and they are called the Bhashya. And it is these commentaries which take into account various facts and try to analyze them and try to weave a common thread from them in order to explain certain phenomenon and find out some pattern. In fact, in the sutra style, this particular effort is made in order to find out a particular pattern in the given data. And so sutra literally is a thread that is woven around a particular set of elements which holds all those elements together. That is what is the primary meaning of the word sutra. And so it applies to the sutras of any particular system of knowledge. For example, and we shall discuss this in detail in the coming slides when we talk about the sutras of Panini and how they codified the knowledge about language and how the tradition of Paninian grammar continued and continued to discuss these sutras, interpret these sutras, and explain them away, and also sometimes accept the difficulty level in the explanation of these sutras. So these methodologies, they primarily can be called the Indian methodologies. Some of them can be seen also developed elsewhere, but primarily they remain Indian historically. Let us now focus on the domain of language and how the system of knowledge related to language developed in India. The terms used for language are very many. There are so many, from the lexica of synonyms that can be collected from our own contribution called Sanskrit WordNet, which is an online thesaurus of Sanskrit, which is linked with 10 such more than thesauri of other Indian languages. We can cull some of these important synonyms of language, and each one of them may have certain different connotations as well, which we do not consider important so far to not consider them as synonyms. Bhasha is an extremely important word used, and we know that historically also the word bhasha was regularly used. This is used in order to refer to the common parlance, that is, the common speech behavior of an individual. That is what is referred to by the word bhasha. On the other hand, the concept of vach, which also means language, which primarily catered to the internal part of the language. Bhasha primarily referred to the external most or the auditory most part of the language, whereas vach refers to or referred to the most internal part of what this bhasha is. So there is this correlation between the bhasha and the vach, which the Indian thinkers constantly thought about and expressed in various treatises. Vani is also an important term used for description of language. Vani primarily refers to something that is close to bhasha. Gir is also another synonym which refers to the element of bhasha. Then comes shabda, which is a very peculiar term that is used for language. This is core philosophical term that is used, and we shall see how this was used and when this was used and by whom this was used, and what are the other implications, what are the connotations of this word, shabda. In general, the word shabda stands for the sound. However, that is not all. In fact, there is something more, or rather quite a lot, to this particular word shabda. Also available are the words bharati, which is also the meaning which comes closer to the meaning of the word bhasha and vani and so on. And finally, Saraswati, which is also the mythological manifestation of this speech, which is considered to be the origin of the development of the human being, and therefore that word is also assigned to the language. So the uses of these different terms in different contexts shows us the different viewpoints that the Indians developed at an early date towards language. So some words indicate that the Indians constantly thought about the sound, which is the external most part of the language, as the language. And we see that currently with all efforts, it is primarily this aspect which the linguists are focused on in analyzing in various fields, be it the phonologists or the morphologists or the syntacticians or the semanticists. They primarily deal with the external most part of the language, namely bhasha. At the same time, the Indians were also involved in deciphering the internal mechanism which forces or which results in the realization or the manifestation of the external most part of the language. What is this internal mechanism which causes a particular term to be used, a particular word to be used in order to denote a particular meaning? What is the meaning of the meaning? What is the nature of the meaning? So all these. So the question is, are the meanings purely intellectual? Do the meanings reside at the intellectual plane, or do they exist in the external world? These were some of the important questions that bothered the Indian thinkers at a very early date, and they figured out solutions to these problems also at a very early date. And that is what makes this entire enterprise a very rich field to explore. And the other important point is the deification of this very important aspect of human life, namely the speech. And so considering it as some kind of deity, some kind of goddess that needs to be worshipped, is typical Indian, which is not found elsewhere in any part of the world. Very recently, and on the same topic, but a little diversion allowing myself to do, we do find, and there are two things, two instances that I would like to narrate. In the ongoing cricket World Cup, we noticed that there were some fans from the other parts of the world. Notably, there was one Australian fan, and he was giving slogans. And one of the slogans that we heard was Australia Mata Ki Jai, when he was also giving slogans. Australia Mata Ki Jai. But this slogan came from an Indian. The Australians cannot think about Australia as Australia Mata. An Indian can think about his own mainland as his Mata, as his mother. So this is typical Indian. And also, I remember that there are so many sutras in praise of the natural water bodies, also known as the rivers in India, considering them and elevating them to the status of mother. So Ganga Mata and Narmada Mata and so on and so forth. And that has not happened in other parts of the world. So when an Indian professor visited Paris, he composed a beautiful praise in honor of the Seine River, Seine Prashasti, as he called it. And people who were around this particular scholar, they got completely stunned by such a prashasti, which otherwise they could not think of. Coming back to the main point, the notable part of the Indian thinking was that the language, which is typically an internal phenomenon as well as an external phenomenon, is raised to the level of making it Saraswati, the goddess that looks after the development of the intellect of the individual. There are three broad fields that the Indians paid attention to when they studied language. They are Shabda Prakriya, where focus was given on the derivation of the speech forms which are visible, Shabda Prakriya, and how certain words come into being by analyzing their meaning and meaning correlations. And the second Prakriya is Artha Prakriya. Artha Prakriya is the derivation of the meanings. Now, Shabda Prakriya and Artha Prakriya also gave rise to the thinking of the unity of the speech, one undivided speech, one undivided sentence, one undivided word, and so on and so forth. Similar is the case of the Artha Prakriya, where one undivided sentence meaning was considered primarily as a unit, which obviously then got decomposed in the padarthas, which later on got also decomposed in the root and suffix format, and root meaning and suffix meaning format. The compositionality of these shabdas and arthas, that becomes extremely important as far as the Indian thinkers are concerned, and this happened at an early date. The most important amongst these fields is the Jnana Prakriya. So how does the Jnana about the Shabda and Artha take place? What are the causes and what is the effect of the Jnana being generated, the cognition being generated, or the knowledge being generated? What is the correlation between one knowledge, one cognition, and the other knowledge or the other cognition? Is there a validation that the second cognition or second knowledge provides to the first knowledge? And then if that validation is provided, how do we deal with the first knowledge. And of course, if the validation is not provided, what is done with the first knowledge? And so, what is the concept of samshaya as well as nishchaya that was specifically dealt with this in this jnana prakriya, and also how the verbal knowledge, how the knowledge of the language leads one to the overall knowledge system, overall knowledge process, which is generated also from different other senses, perception as well as inference, and so on and so forth. So in this particular matter, one of the delicate points is, what is the cognition made up of? This was a very important question that the Indians discovered. First of all, in a way, they discovered this question, and they answered the question by saying that the jnana consists of nothing but the shabda. So shabda and jnana, they are interrelated. The jnana is of the form of the shabda, and the shabda is of the form of the jnana. So anyway, this jnana prakriya is very crucial, very important from this point of view, which has got quite a lot to offer in the modern research related to various fields, including the language processing in various modern disciplines like cognitive science and so on and so forth. However, it is very difficult to pinpoint the correlation directly, because that would be little far-fetched as well. So I simply quote this jnana prakriya as a word, and let the processes involved be known, and then probably one can imagine what kind of correlation existed or what kind of correlation exists. So these prakriyas, they primarily fall into two domains. The philosophy of language is the modern domain in which artha prakriya and jnana prakriya fall in, and also derivation of speech forms, the external most of speech forms. So in this, the shabda prakriya falls in. These three broad fields are related to the field of language, and the Indians worked quite hard right from the early date in order to contribute to these fields and to know more about various factors in various points in these fields. There were these four traditions of thought listed on the left-hand side of the slide: Shiksha, Pratishakya, Nirukta, and Vyakarana, which dealt with the Shabda Prakriya as well as the Artha Prakriya as well as the Jnana Prakriya. So Shiksha and Pratishakya primarily dealt with the Shabda Prakriya. Nirukta primarily dealt with the Artha Prakriya, and Vyakarana dealt with the Shabda Prakriya as well as the Artha Prakriya as well as the Jnana Prakriya. Now, when we talk about the Vyakarana, immediately springs to our mind the grammarian named Panini, who composed his grammar of Sanskrit. And we know that Panini himself refers to 10 plus grammarians in his own treatise called Ashtadhyayi. And we also know that within the Sanskritic tradition, there are 10 plus non-Paninian traditions available today. Some of them are in practice even today. And some of them are available in the form of the texts that are available today. Apart from the Sanskrit traditions, there are also some other important traditions in Tamil, for example, which are equally significant. We will currently focus on this Sanskritic tradition and will move forward to get some more knowledge about this particular tradition. Let us take a quick overview of the authors and the texts in the Paninian grammatical tradition, and let us in brief sum the contribution of these scholars and these texts that they composed. So the first and the foremost name in the Paninian grammatical tradition is that of Panini, who is believed to have lived about 5th century BCE. Now, some modern scholars have also proposed, and based on some numismatic evidence, have brought the date of Panini to the 4th century BCE. But nonetheless, other scholars still believe that it is the 5th century BCE, which should be the date of Panini. Panini composed a text called Ashtadhyayi, which suggests its own form, namely that it consists of 8 chapters, Ashta Adhyaya, and each of these chapters consists of sub-chapters, which consist of sutras, and so overall there are around 4,000 sutras composed in the Ashtadhyayi in order to explain the Sanskrit, the language that is called today Sanskrit. We know that probably at the time when Panini composed his grammar, the same language was probably not referred to as Sanskrit, probably, but definitely the grammar does refer to this language as Bhasha and analyzes the language in a typical methodology that is very unique and that has also contributed to the development of various linguistic theories in the modern world. When the modern world came into contact with Ashtadhyayi, they came across the unique features of this particular style, and that's what resulted in various theories that were put forward by great scholars who acknowledge the death of Ashtadhyayi and the death of Panini that exists in this particular field of language analysis. Ashtadhyayi is a text that is composed in the sutra style. Obviously, this entire text written in sutra style became a subject of memorization, and it was kept alive in the memory for almost more than 2000 years. And the oral transmission of this text continued in a manner which preserved this particular text. Also, it was written down at a point in time. However, the oral transmission of this particular text continued, and it is done even today in a particular manner, giving it the status of the Vedanga, the important part of the Veda, and therefore becoming the part of the Vedic transmission process. Needless to say that this sutra style text needed explanation, and it underwent a thorough examination at the hands of the next scholar in line called Katyayana, who is believed to have lived around 300 BCE, who composed the glosses, which were known as Vartikas, which examined the statements made by Panini, which brought in modifications in the statements made by Panini, mainly because those sutras were not relevant in accordance with the data that was collected by Katyayana. So as the language changes, the linguistic data also changes, obviously, and therefore the job of the grammarian demands that the grammarian takes note of such changes, and instead of then changing the data, the grammarian starts to modify the rules and brings in some change in the existing rule in order to cover the newly formed data. And that is what Katyayana precisely is found doing in order to account for the data that was coming in newly and which needed the modification in the text of the Ashtadhyayi. The later Paninian grammatical tradition did one thing very rightly. Although Katyayana suggested some modifications, although Katyayana suggested that some sutras in the text of the Ashtadhyayi be rejected because they are not relevant anymore, the later Paninian grammatical tradition did not reject, did not remove all such sutras from the text of Ashtadhyayi. They preserved these sutras and transmitted them to the next generation. And now we have a very clear historical picture about which sutras were rejected and which sutras were considered to be of no use. And the reason for them to be not useful is primarily the correlation of the data available at that point in time. So the text that was composed by Katyayana is called Vartika, namely the glosses that Katyayana composed. Now, they also required an elaborate elaborate examination, which was provided by a scholar who flourished around 150 BCE called Patanjali. He composed a text called the Vyakarana Mahabhashya, or the Great Commentary. In this particular commentary, again the same methodology is followed, and wherever the sutras of Panini are not enabling the generation of the form that is currently in use at the time of Patanjali, such sutras which are found irrelevant by Patanjali and are suggested for omissions by Patanjali. At this point in time, we also observe the intersection of the grammatical literature with the other literature in the history of intellectual traditions in India, notably the Hermeneuticians, also known in the Sanskrit tradition as the Mimamsakas. So there is quite a lot of intersection between the Mimamsakas and the Mahabhashya, and we clearly see that there are certain concepts which are also discussed in the Mahabhashya, which are primarily those of the Mimamsakas. So Patanjali provided a comment on the text of the Ashtadhyayi. The main contribution of these three scholars lies in the fact that they wrote a grammar of a living language. Therefore, they observed the modifications that kept on happening in the course of time. They, in order to account for these changes, suggested the modifications in their respective grammatical sutras, respective grammatical rules. So the concept of grammatical rule that was quite emphatically brought forward by these three scholars, notable amongst them Panini. He composed these rules. He also provided ordering principles to some rules. He also provided certain criteria when certain rules come in the conflict. He devised a mechanism which indicated the scope of application of the rules. The main principle, the main theory Panini advocated was, and the main methodology he followed in the description of grammar was that of substitution. Substitution is a particular methodology where element A is replaced by element B as far as the grammatical rules are concerned when the meaning element, namely C, is constant. So in a particular meaning which is conveyed by the particular word, an element A is replaced by element B. So both element A and B, they convey one and the same meaning. However, in certain environments, A appears, and in certain other environments, B also appears. Those environments, those specifications need to be jotted down and need to be followed in order to understand this particular rule. So Panini is believed to have leveraged this particular methodology to its fullest, the methodology of the substitution. And the other important point is, apart from this methodology, Panini also suggested a unique way of coding or codifying this particular information. So Panini is probably one of the earliest grammarians to have used the concept of the meta language very effectively. So we know that the language is something that is to be described, and the meta language is the language in which that something is to be described. Now, the language in which you want to describe something also has some rules, also has some codes, and also can be governed by those rules. So the metalinguistic rules composed by Panini allowed him to affect a brief exposition, a brief codification of a huge data set called the data set of the Sanskrit language. So the style of the arrangement of the rules in the Ashtadhyayi, bound by the principles of continuation, also known as anuvritti, make this entire treatise a very unique one and also very, very important and imitable one. And therefore, it is not a big surprise that this particular style was imitated by many scholars. Some are the modern scholars as well. In fact, the entire non-Paninian grammatical tradition of Sanskrit is following the same methodology. Even the grammar of the Prakrit written by the great scholar also is following the same procedure. We also find some of the similar procedures followed in the Tamil grammar as well. Also, in the modern situation, the grammar of, for example, Marathi was also written down following the same methodology applied by Panini. So these are some key contributions, key and important contributions of Panini. the key contributions of the thought process of Katyayana and Patanjali seem to be that they brought in the concept of cognition as far as the linguistic analysis is concerned. So Patanjali and Katyayana, they should be credited for bringing in this important element. So they said that the external auditory speech is a mere effect of something that happens internally. And when a particular substitution needs to be made, it needs to be made not just in the external sounds, but it needs to be made in the buddhi, at the intellectual level, where the conceiving of the linguistic form primarily happens. So Patanjali also describes, and Katyayana also describes, a peculiar statement, which is Karya Viparinamadva. This is the statement of Katyayana, and Patanjali describes it, namely Karya Buddhi. So Buddhi Viparinama, this is what Patanjali is describing, which is an extremely significant development. Next, we come to Bhartrhari, who flourished around 500 CE, who wrote a very important treatise called Vakyapadiya, which is considered to be a seminal treatise on the philosophy of language. What language is? What is the nature of the language? Can it be treated as one whole unit? And then can it be related to in some other philosophical schools to the overall human goals called the Purusharthas. Bhartrhari's contribution is to elevate the philosophy of language and take it to the position of another school of thought. The key concept explained and propounded by Bhartrhari seems to be Shabda Brahma, which is refuted by several subsequent scholars. However, Bhartrhari propounded it without, Bhartrhari propounded it in as strong a manner as possible in his text called Vakya Padiya. Bhartrhari also took forward Patanjali's line of thought, wherein the cognitive aspect of the human being, cognitive fact of the human being, is carried forward and then is ascribed to be the cause of the externally audible speech form. That seems to be the most important contribution of Bhartrhari to this particular development of the thought. Next, we have a scholar duo called Jayaditya and Vamana, which lived around 700 CE, and they composed a text called Kashika Vritti, which is the known complete commentary on the Ashtadhyayi. Even the Mahabhashya of Patanjali did not comment on all the sutras composed by Panini. Kashika Vritti is the only available text which comments on each and every sutra of the Ashtadhyayi. And this commentary provides a useful help in understanding the explanation of the sutras in the Ashtadhyayi. The consistency in following certain principles propounded by the earlier scholars is what is the hallmark of this particular text. So in a way, this particular text carries forward the linguistic development that have happened till this particular date. And these developments are carried forward and handed over to the next generation, where we come across another scholar called Jinendra Buddhi, who flourished around 800 and 800 CE, who composed a text called Kashika Vivarana Panjika or Nyasa to explain the nuances, the difficult lines, the difficult argument points in the text of the Kashika Vritti. An interesting story about Jinendra Buddhi is the fact that there are some manuscripts of some other works composed by this Jinendra Buddhi, which were found in China not very far away in a few years ago. And interesting story is about the retrieval of those manuscripts and finally the publication of the text from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, Vienna. The next important author in the tradition of Paninian grammar is Kayyata, who flourished around 1000 CE. This is a commentary. This is an author who composed a commentary on the text of the Vyakarana Mahabhashya, and this commentary is called Pradeepa. This is considered to be an extremely important commentary if one has to understand the great Vyakarana Mahabhashya. Although not so striking can be said about the contribution of this particular commentary. However, what is so striking about this commentary is that it commented on the earlier existing texts and made them available for the future generations. And so continuation of this entire thought process is what is the hallmark of the texts like Kayyata's Pradeepa as well as the Kashika Vritti of Jayaditya and Vamana. This continuation is extremely important, which we don't see about several of the other traditions. And that is the reason why this Paninian tradition is stressed and presented and demonstrated as an important and a striking example of the continuation of the Indian knowledge system. Then we have Dharmakirti, who flourished around 1100 CE, who composed a text called Rupavatara, in which the thematic arrangement of the sutras in the Ashtadhyayi was made. This was something unique. So far, Ashtadhyayi was arranged in a particular manner. Now, the same text is rearranged following certain themes. As this fashion will get refined in the course of time, as we shall see, the beginning of this particular process happens with Rupavatara of Dharmakirti, who is followed by Haradatta, who composed an important text called Padamanjari, which is also composed around 1100 CE. This is a commentary on the Kashika Vritti. This is an extensive commentary that also carries forward the tradition that was brought about till this date, forward, examined, and also commented upon and taken forward. The manuscripts of these texts, they are found in almost all the places in India. I have myself collected more than 200 manuscripts of the text of the Kashika Vritti from all over India and abroad. They are also written down in several scripts, beginning with Devanagari and Grantha and Kannada and Malayalam and Telugu, Bengali, Sharada, Nandinagari, and so on and so forth. Tulu also. So they were studied all over India. That means the traditions were prevalent. And then, of course, we have the next callers. But before moving forward, let me ask Professor Saikia as to how we are doing with the timeline. Should I stop here in order to have some discussion? And then I can continue with this tomorrow as well.
Yeah, I think, Professor Kulkarni, it may be nice to ask and give them an opportunity to ask some questions and
Sure,
continue
sure,
tomorrow.
sure.
Yeah.
So I will, with this particular slide, the third slide amongst from the authors and texts, I will stop here and we'll continue with the discussion tomorrow, and would like to have some questions and comments. Thank you all for patient listening.
So thank you very much, Professor Kulkarni, for a very lucid and detailed talk on Indian knowledge systems, starting from the basics and taking us to some of the seminal texts, particularly on language and grammar. So can I invite the participants to unmute yourself and ask any questions or make any comments?
There's a question.
There is a question. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Says, can you elaborate on method of substitutions with an example?
When we deal with any linguistic data, there are variations that we find in the auditory speech forms, even when the semantic aspect remains the same. For example, in Sanskrit, or even let's take the example of English, when we want to talk about plurals. So in some cases, z as a sound is used. So boy becomes boys, and sometimes s is used. Sometimes zero is used. For example, sheep would be sheep in plural. Sometimes some other elements are used. Child becomes children, and so on. So there are these variations. However, the common thread amongst all these forms seems to be the semantic aspect, where there is plurality involved, singularity and plurality. Now, how do you explain these linguistic facts in the form of grammatical rule? That is a question. And this question can be answered in the following way, namely, amongst z or s or en or zero suffix, if we have these four options, we might look at the frequency of these options, and whichever option occurs more frequently can be considered to be the basic starting point about the plurality explanation. And then we would say that in certain limited environments, this basic starting point can be substituted by those respective word elements. This is how this entire dataset would be explained. For example, in Sanskrit, we have the instrumental plural of different words, like deva. We have instrumental plural as devaihi, hari haribhihi, bhanu bhanubhihi, dhatru dhatrubhihi, and so on. Now, the majority of the forms end in bhihi when the instrumental plural is expressed. So, Panini, as a grammarian, takes a stand that there is one case which looks odd enough, and that needs to be explained. But if there are 7 out of 8 cases in which Bhihi is seen used by the people in order to express the instrumental plurality, then we start the process of the grammatical derivation with Bhihi as the starting point. And we say that in the limited environment of a particular kind, this Bhihi is substituted by Aihi. And that limited environment is the root word which ends in short And so that is how the rule would be created in order to account for the entire data set. Now, the core aspect that Panini keeps in mind is not to lose any element in the data set. But the data set is not uniform, and we cannot expect it to be uniform. For people have different tendencies, following which they speak differently. They are bound to speak differently. You cannot force them to speak in a uniform manner. The job of the grammarian is to take note of all such varied, different forms and to figure out how to weave a rule, how to weave a thread, how to figure out a pattern around which the entire data set will be accounted for. And one way, which is less cost prone way, is to make a rule which takes into account most of the cases and then use the technique of substitution where an element A is substituted by B when the meaning is constant to account for the exceptional form. So this is how the technique of substitution is used in the Paninian system, Paninian grammar. In fact, there is a very good book written by Ivan Karsh, University of Cambridge, UK, The Indian Semantic Analysis. In this particular book, this methodology of substitution is very nicely, elaborately explained. And in fact, this particular methodology seems to be the hallmark, the USP of the Paninian system, which is also followed by the modern thinkers in different ways, different manifestations. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to you, Professor Kulkarni.